Everybody, and welcome to the Women Talking Money podcast. I'm Gretchen from Magenta Financial Planning and She Finance, and today I'm really pleased to welcome Sarah Pennells to the show. Sarah joined Royal London in 2020 and works as a consumer finance specialist, acting as a spokesperson on a wide range of consumer finance issues, including the cost of living, financial resilience, saving, budgeting, and the state pension. Before joining Royal London, Sarah was an award-winning personal finance journalist and broadcaster, appearing across outlets including BBC Breakfast and BBC Radio 4's Money Box. She's also the founder of Savvy Woman, a money-based website created for women, which she ran for 10 years. Sarah, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Do you want to just begin by sort of, building on that introduction a little bit and telling us a little bit about yourself and your career journey so far?
Yeah, absolutely. My first sort of grown-up job, I guess, was working in local radio. So I was working for a local radio station and I was booking guests and a whole range of things. And I ended up working on a business program, which I sort of edited for a couple of years. And out of that came my first job in personal finance, which was working on, you mentioned that I'd worked on Moneybox. So I applied for a job on Moneybox on Radio 4, and I ended up being a producer there and also a reporter and stand-in presenter for about 6 years. So I would go off and do attachments to other BBC programs. But that was really where my interest in and obviously knowledge of personal finance started, because I hadn't had a personal finance job before. And in fact, I didn't really find personal finance that interesting. I kind of found it a mixture of a bit dull and a bit anxiety inducing. But I applied for this job, and as soon as I started working at Moneybox, and obviously it was a very steep learning curve in terms of the subject matter, but I also realised how much I was learning personally and just how empowering it was to get a bit of financial knowledge. So I was there for 6 years, and then I went freelance. I worked I did writing for newspapers. I wrote 3 books. I worked for the breakfast programme on the BBC as a consumer finance reporter. And as you said, I created and ran a money website for women on money, because at the time I didn't feel that serious topics like pensions and investments were being really talked about, assuming the audience was female.
Wow, lots of things there. And just like, yeah, I mean, we hear Moneybox on the news, we listen to it, we've all heard it. And so I'm really thrilled to be talking to you today, because I think you're, I've known about your career and what you've been doing for so long. So it's great. I mean, this podcast is about just talking about money. I want to kind of try and just open up the dialogue so much more about being honest about money. And part of that is understanding, where we've come from, what we've done in the past, how we can learn from those things. And I guess just having more day-to-day dialogue about things around finance.
Which is really important. And as you say, it's not something that everybody talks about when they're growing up. I mean, some people do, some people don't. And it can really shape how you feel about money.
Absolutely. And I think also the fact that we can be, as you say, just sort of like find it anxiety inducing, find it confusing, find it boring, all of those things, but trying to apply ourselves in a way that means that we can just be so much better with our money. And if we're open and talk about it, everyone else is feeling like that, then
yes,
we can break down some of those barriers.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's not a competition, it's not about how good you are with money compared to somebody else, because if you play that game, then unless you're a financial genius, there will always be somebody who's better at money than you. But that's not what it's about. And I think when I started learning about money, and as I said, it was when I was on Moneybox, and I had to learn about money for the program. But I did realize that, I started making better money decisions quite quickly, actually. And I realized that it was about the direction of travel and not the sort of speed necessarily. So it's feeling that you're making better decisions on a day-by-day basis, not necessarily that you're getting to a particular point faster than somebody else. But just to give you an example, I was going to join the BBC pension scheme as soon as I could anyway. I mean, most people who worked at the BBC who had that chance did. But I guess not surprisingly, people who worked at Moneybox talked about pensions a lot. Not only did they understand pensions, but they were generally pretty enthusiastic about them. So one of the things I did at the BBC, directly as a result of being surrounded by people who talked about pensions, not as if they were a bit difficult to understand and kind of, is that something I need to think about now? But as something that was really important because, in terms of the life you want when you stop work. So one of the things I did was to pay in more, and actually paid in as much as I could. Now, I was only staff at the BBC for about sort of 5-6 years, so I'm not going to be retiring on millions or anything, but paying that extra has made a difference, will make a difference to how much I get. And I am pretty sure that is not something I would have done if I'd been working on a program that didn't feature finance and didn't have colleagues who were just explaining these things and saying this is really important and it's important to do sooner rather than as you're heading towards that time when you can really picture your retirement.
Yeah, and it is so difficult when you're that age, when you've got this length of time to retirement, whatever that might look like now for people, to think about that. And I think as well, in today's society where something you said a moment ago, which was about that it's not as fast as you can do it. It's about like making small, headway. We live in a society where that's not how we live anymore. Everything is about how fast you can do it, how well you can do it, how brilliant it can look immediately.
Yes, yeah. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm quite glad I didn't grow up in that world because I'm not sure how well I would have fared. But yes, it is often about sort of, getting information instantly. Obviously, many of us are using AI more, so not just information, but recommendations, sometimes good, sometimes bad, and depending on the area of your life, showing everybody else how marvelous it is. But I think you're right that it is about thinking about these things as early as you can. I mean, there's lots of data that shows how much easier, inverted commas, it is to save, for example, for your pension if you start earlier rather than later. Now, the good thing is, thanks to automatic enrolment, people who are employed are being at least put into a pension for when they're, age 22, assuming they reach the kind of earnings qualification thresholds without having to fill in the paperwork. And, as you know very well, their employer will pay in as well as them paying in. So that is one thing that certainly wasn't around when I was starting out in my working life. We know, I mean, the data shows us, because of the magic of compound growth, that if you do put money in those early years, it can make a big difference. So I'm not going to, have lots of figures, but there was one I was actually looking it up earlier on, and it was saying something like, I think if you start saving when you're 18, which is admittedly quite young, if you put just £100 a month aside for 50 years until you're 68, which would be your state pension age, assuming that you start at 18 under sort of current plans, and you save that £100 a month, and this is assuming you get no money from your employer, you're just saving on your own there.
Yeah.
So in that 50-year period, it would have grown to something like I think about £137,000. So you put in 60,000 and the growth could be around sort of 77,000. Obviously, you're making assumptions here about how much it grows by, but not crazy ones. Now, if you waited 25 years, you're kind of thinking, well, actually, I'm 43 now. Now retirement feels quite real. Now I'm thinking, what do I do? Well, you'd end up with about, I think you'd end up with compound growth of about 14,000 instead of 70. You'd still have put in 30,000. You'd get a pot of about 44. Now, obviously, you might end up with something bigger or smaller, but it's just to illustrate actually how powerful those early contributions are. And as I said, I'm very glad that I was surrounded by people who enthused in the way they did, because I think it didn't just influence me when I was at the BBC, but when I left the BBC, I went freelance, which I've been for most of my life until I joined Royal London. I did know, because I didn't have that structure of being employed, which has lots of benefits, not least the money comes straight out of your wages into your pension without you thinking about it.
Yeah.
I remember thinking, if I don't set up a pension straight away, I may not do it, or I may not do it. There will always be something, as someone who works for themselves, there will always be a reason not to lock that money away, because, a tax bill or someone not paying. And I think I did it in the first couple of months. I didn't do it in the first month. And again, I work for a pensions company. You might expect me to say this, but this is genuinely stuff I was doing before I joined them. But I'm really glad I did that. Quite proud of the younger me, actually, for doing it.
Yeah.
And I also arranged for my premiums to increase by 5% a year, because I just thought, again, if I don't do that, assuming I start earning more once I'm more established, well, it'll be a decision that I might not take. And those kind of things, there were times when companies didn't pay or when I didn't have as much work as I hoped for. But actually, because the money went without me making a conscious decision, it was never that thing of like, well, actually, I can't do this now, or I wish I hadn't done it. And I genuinely think my retirement would have looked very different if I hadn't done that, because I do think, especially when you work for yourself, it does feel a bit like, should I do this or should I keep this money just in case?
Yeah, and there's a fear factor, isn't there, about that, and about feeling vulnerable when you're self-employed and where's the next, fee going to come from. But that automation thing is really key, isn't it? Automate what you can, think about how much you're going to do it, get it automated, maybe get it increasing, and then that you're not having to think about it. It's absolutely just happening in the background, and like all your other bills, you get used to it.
Yeah, I think you really hit on something there, because sometimes, if you're not somebody who finds money inherently fascinating, and some people do, it's kind of like, actually, I really want to understand this. It doesn't faze me at all. I feel very comfortable. I know what I want for my money. And then some people, struggle. And I certainly did struggle in my kind of earlier years. I just didn't find it interesting. And I said, found it quite anxiety inducing. But by starting to do those things when I was sort of not forced to learn about it, because obviously I chose to apply for the job in the first place. But as I was learning about it professionally, I was like, actually, this is incredibly powerful. And I now feel so much more confident, even just, a few months later. And it was that thing of, I used to kind of, when I was much younger, sort of save when I had, wait to the end of the month, think I can put aside this much. And I changed that to sort of paying myself first and saving from when I got paid. And I obviously mentioned the pension. And once that money goes out, just in the same way, and I know we've had the cost of living crisis and we still have high bills. So some people, paying household bills is a struggle, and it is something they notice. But there are a lot of people for whom it's like, okay, it may be a lot of money, but it's stuff I know I have to pay. So therefore, I don't think, will I pay my energy bill this month, or will I choose not to, rent, mortgage, whatever it is. It's something I know I have to pay. Therefore, I plan what's left. And it is, as you say, that automation of thinking, okay, I'll set this up, I'll do this. And then it just sort of chugs away in the background without me having to manually do something every month, or make a decision, or make those choices.
I think it's, the message is kind of, or at least the statistics and all of the research says that that's just our best way to kind of deal with it for everybody. So we digress a little bit on that, but that was all really, really good. I'd like to just ask you one question, which I do ask everyone, and to kind of start the conversation from a different way, which is about your earliest memories of money, and how do you think that shaped your views sort of prior to that, joining Moneybox, and then education from that?
So when I was growing up, I think one of the messages that I really took away from both my parents, I think more so my mum, because she was at home in my sort of earliest years, was my mum had this great ability to make a little go a long way. And I'm not in any way sort of getting out a tiny violin, but my parents are both, my dad was a bus driver, my mum was running a school kitchen. So there wasn't a huge amount of money to spare, but I didn't feel like we went without. So she definitely was very good at kind of making a little sort of go a long way. And that was, I think I've really picked that up from her. But my mum was Austrian, and she grew up, Austria had a real problem with hyperinflation in the kind of sort of late 19s, so like after the First World War, and early 1920s. And when I say, obviously we've been through a period where inflation has been higher than many of us can remember for a while. But when I say that inflation hit 150% a month in something like 1922, I mean, that gives you an idea of what the inflation was. And my mum grew up, I think, with her parents and her older family members sort of telling her about this, of, literally kind of wheelbarrows of currency being used to buy a loaf of bread. So she didn't really trust savings in a way, or it took her a while to get into that. I remember when I was growing up, I never remember her particularly talking about saving or being aware that my mum and dad had much by way of savings, although that did change in later life. But I think that was quite a powerful memory for her, for understandable reasons. Having said that, when my sister and I got pocket money, we were encouraged to save. So there was definitely some of that sort of, good habit being sort of imparted on us. Although my sister was definitely better at saving than I was when I was kind of quite young. I guess like a lot of families, money wasn't talked about that much as I was growing up. And I think when I went to university, it felt like there were all these decisions that I had to make that I wasn't very well equipped for. And I'm not laying that at my parents' feet. It was just, that's how I felt. And I'm lucky enough to have gone to university when I didn't have to take out a loan, and I got a small grant. And I remember getting the grant for the first time, which had to last for, the whole term or whatever. And it was more money than I'd ever had in my life. So I do remember kind of struggling. That's when I think I found money quite anxiety inducing, because although I had some good messages from my parents, I think I was also, if I'm being honest, it was a time when I was rebelling against that sort of stuff. It all seemed quite sensible. And I think that's where I got the idea that I wasn't good at managing money, because I'd had these decisions that I was facing, didn't feel very well equipped, made some not great choices, nothing dramatic, but
No.
And then I felt like, well, this is something I can't really do. And it was, I think that followed me for a few years, and then I sort of switched off from it. And I said, as I mentioned, obviously, it's only when I sort of started learning about it as part of my job that really changed, and changed quite quickly.
I can resonate loads with it. I remember sort of feeling that I'd been like given this amazing freedom to go to university and study what you wanted to study, have the opportunity, but kind of, never having enough, never making the monthly amount quite last as long as it needed to. And it is, I remember having to make phone calls saying, I don't have enough money. And that's definitely anxiety inducing. And it did lead to quite a hangover for that. And then, of course, I started working for a financial advisor. And like you, my skill set in that went, completely different. But I think so many people don't do that. We're both saying that we went and then worked in the industry, which gave us the skills to manage it, but actually the majority of people aren't doing that, and so are kind of muddling through after all of the same things.
Yeah, and I think just it's interesting you said that my kind of experience of going to university kind of resonated with you as well, because when I think about sort of friends and peers when I was at university, my bank offered me a credit card. I think it had a limit of something like £175 at the time, so we're not talking big bucks. But I took it. I thought it was marvelous, and I didn't go crazy, but I did buy things. I remember buying some books. Not books for my course, but just novels, because I was really into reading, And I hadn't really worked. I just didn't know, and I hadn't thought about it, to be honest, how much the interest would add. And I remember, so there were some of my friends who were very, sensible, and I'm saying that in a positive way, and weren't using a credit card. And I remember there were a couple of other friends who it just didn't bother them at all that they owed all this money. And I was somewhere in between. So I wasn't borrowing a lot, but it was really stressing me out. So I could see some who were just kind of like, well, what's the bank going to do, sort of thing, quite blasé about it. Most of my friends, I have to say, were at the other end of kind of like, well, I've got to make this money last. But I said it did definitely follow me for a few years. And I did always feel like, I was renting places, renting a flat to live in and things, and always thinking, well, I've got to pay this, but feeling quite stressed about kind of making sure that I had enough to live on.
Well, and of course, once you've come through Studentville, you've suddenly got to really think about your credit history, and you've got to really think about how that's going to impact you, going forward. And I think, that's that layer of real life suddenly comes on board and makes it very different, from being a student as well.
We did some research a few years ago, because again, that was something that I remember when I realized what a credit file and credit report was, and that actually other companies, companies will be looking at it, making decisions about you based on that information, which I'd not appreciated what a credit report was. And it was that thing. And I remember sort of thinking, well, there's part of me that didn't really want to kind of look at it. And there was the other part, the rational part, thinking, well, they're making decisions based on what's on there, so I may as well see it. And in fact, it was fine. But so we did some research a few years ago, about 3 years ago, looking at whether people had got a copy of their credit report, and if so, what they found. And there was quite a lot of misinformation. So quite a few people had got their credit report, but a lot of people didn't know you could get it for free. Some people found mistakes, about I think it was about 1 in 4 who found mistakes, some of which were very minor, but some of which weren't. And they didn't know that they could get it corrected, or how to get it corrected, or they tried. So as you say, this kind of information is not only powerful at the time, but it can have an effect, depending on what the information is on your credit file, for kind of up to 6 years. So what you're doing today could impact those kind of decisions and choices that you have, certainly for the next few years, if not longer.
Absolutely. And I think, it actually also ties in a little bit with our understanding of actually sometimes having a credit card that's manageable and repaying it and building up your credit history can help you, and you can actively make your credit history better by and just being someone who doesn't have any of those things doesn't necessarily add to, it might not make your credit history look worse, but it certainly doesn't add to being able to get through next time, later in your life, when you want to, for example, buy a house or maybe get a car through a lease or something like that. You'll not have the credit history that you need. So having, building that up can help.
Yes. I mean, it feels quite counterintuitive that if you haven't borrowed, that could cause problems. But I guess, I mean, what the companies would say is they've got less to base the decision on, because they haven't got a track record that they can work out how you're managing credit. So yes, you wouldn't kind of say everybody run up and down the high street and getting credit card. Well, it's not high street anymore because you obviously get them online, but in some circumstances, for some people, it can actually be a good thing, as long as it doesn't, as it did for me when I was a student, make you think, oh, actually, I'll spend this without having a plan for paying it off.
Absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I guess I'm interested in understanding maybe a little bit more about how the money worries or that anxiety that you've previously experienced earlier on around money, whether, there's one that you can pick out that has kind of shaped your choices as you've gone through in making better decisions.
I don't know that there's one turning point. I think there are a couple of things that have had a big impact on the money decisions that I've made. And I've talked about sort of the effect on how I thought about pensions and retirement savings. I think the other actually, though, comes from having worked for myself for 20 years, so for the majority of my working life. And there is always that insecurity, I think. It feels like you're either crazily busy and you're desperate for a holiday, but you can never take time off, or maybe you're not so busy and you're thinking nobody's ever going to want to work with me again. Now, those ups and downs obviously kind of ride out over time, but what I didn't plan for when I first started working for myself, but which had more of an impact than I thought it would, was companies, well, should we say, taking time to pay. And that got worse over the years. There were some companies I worked with who were always amazing at paying, and there were lots of companies who would pay kind of bang on time. And then there were some who would take their time. It could be that you filed your invoice through one system, and then after 2 months, someone would come back and say, no, you need to file it through a different system. But that was, I think that was always in my mind, that I didn't have that salary anymore. And, the buck stops with you in a slightly different way. So although I did, as I said, I set up a pension very early on, and that money carried on coming out of my earnings. But I do think it sort of shaped some other decisions that I made, just in terms of, things like sort of, I wanted to have some work done on my house, but I didn't for a long time because I just didn't feel secure enough in increasing my borrowing. And I think actually, in hindsight, I don't really regret it. But I think if I'd been employed, I wouldn't have had that qualm, really. And I think the other thing, and it's not really, this may not be quite sort of answering your question, but I mentioned my parents now. Both my parents died a number of years ago, and both were living with dementia when they died. And that was something that obviously had a huge emotional effect on me, but it also, it was kind of a bit of a sharp reminder about things like, planning ahead for when you can no longer make decisions, and planning ahead for when you die, which is kind of, I think two of the nasties that few of us would rush to think about. Now, I did have a will. I've had a will for years, but I hadn't really thought about it. I'm glad I ticked that one off the box, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And hadn't gone back to it. And I didn't have a power of attorney. I was kind of like, I'm far too young to have one of those. Why would I want a power of attorney? But when my dad was diagnosed with dementia, and it was very slow progressing, so he lived with it for a long time before he died. My mum was diagnosed with it quite a few years later, and it was much more sort of a rapid decline. But we had set up a power of attorney for both my mum and dad before they had dementia, never thinking we'd use it actually, but just thinking, well, sort of just in case. And, we ended up using it for both my parents, and that made life much easier, actually having that legal right to be able to make decisions on someone else's behalf and therefore pay their bills without having to apply to the court of protection for that, which I think can take a long time. It's certainly more costly. The wait time can be quite significant. And the whole process of managing someone else's money through that arrangement is there's a more rigid framework, shall we say. So I think for some people it can be quite stressful. So that was something. Basically, I then got a power of attorney for myself because I was thinking, I realised how useful this was, and I wouldn't want anybody else, should the worst happen, to have to apply to the Court of Protection and have that stress. And I did update my will because sorting out probate for a parent, it's incredibly hard. I found it very hard emotionally. It was not too bad from a kind of form filling or legal point of view because I sort of knew roughly what to expect. It's not the easiest thing, but I was very, very grateful that my parents both had up to date before they had dementia wills in the last 10, 15 years before they died, and that we knew where the will was kept. And I kind of feel, I describe it as an act of kindness for those people who are left behind, if you have a will, because it meant that we were clear about what they wanted, who they wanted to inherit. And depending on how detailed you are, and I'm quite detailed in my will, you can be really clear about what kind of funeral you want and all that kind of stuff. And also, if you don't have a will, you'll know this very well, but the rules around who gets what may not reflect what you want. I'm lucky I have some friends who are really close to me. Well, they wouldn't inherit anything, and there are some friends who I want to leave something to. So there's a whole load of things that you can do. But I was very grateful when I was sorting out first my dad's and then my mum's kind of estate that I didn't have to think, what would they have wanted? And from an admin point of view, it definitely made it easier having a will in place rather than them not.
Goodness, yeah. I'm so pleased you brought it up because actually it doesn't get brought up that often on this podcast because I think, for some reason, we just, but it has come up before. And I think it's really important to reflect on. And also, especially given probably most of our listeners are going to be people who are at some point caring for or assisting their parents as they get older. And we always speak to clients about everyone needing a lasting power of attorney, but it's the last thing you think about when you're 20, 30, 40, it feels very weird to kind of go, or even maybe 50, feels, it's too early to get that power of attorney in place. But I actually think it's vital. And for the reasons that you've mentioned, but also I'd also add, if you're running a business, if you are the main breadwinner, or you are running a business that wouldn't be able to keep going without you, how that's going to be wound up, where everything is, what's going on. It's not necessarily just about what happens if my healthcare fails at an older age. It could be something else that crops up. So I think it's really important to mention. So thank you for bringing it up because I think it's a nice reminder to everyone.
It is. I think I think sometimes it feels counterintuitive because I think some people assume, and for completely understandable reasons, well, if if my husband becomes ill or my partner, then surely, or a family member, then surely I'd have the right to sort out, I'm the person who's closest to them, my dad or whoever it is, then surely wouldn't I just have the right to do that? And of course that isn't, as that's not how the law works. But it feels a bit like, well, why should I have to have a legal document? Because wouldn't I just take over anyway? I know them very well, no secrets, or whatever it is. So actually there's that whole thing of, well, of course I won't need when I'm far too young, but also some people it's not even on their radar because they don't even think it will be an issue until, if somebody does have dementia or whatever it is, and for whatever reason has lost mental capacity, cannot make decisions, then you've got to start kind of trying to catch up, and it can be very difficult.
Yeah, really, really, really difficult. And I'm sure, we've had experience of it with clients where these things just make things so much easier. And as you say, the admin burden of being an executor of a power of attorney, it is a really big thing. And I think also, because you're so asked, aren't you? On your will, you asked who would be your executors, and then on your power of attorney, who would be your attorneys. I think probably the power of attorney, you think about it more. You think, hang on, they're going to have to make decisions for me whilst I'm still alive. And you probably think more about who those people might be. I think quite often with wills, it's like, well, we'll put that person because they're my brother or sister, or we'll put that person because they're my best friend. But actually, I think we should really, really be thinking, they know they are close to me, but also are they financially or like emotion, how are they going to be able to deal with what we're asking them to do? How are they going to be able to manage? Do they have the ability to be able to do that? And then having that as an extra layer when you're thinking about who you name as your executors.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because now obviously you can have a solicitor either as the main executor or alongside, or another professional. But if you are going to use friends or family members, then it has to be someone who's comfortable filling in forms. It sounds obvious, but
Yeah,
some people find that really difficult. And some of the forms, even if someone's situation is relatively straightforward, are quite long. And there are things, you have to get the property valued if there is a property and so on. As you say, you might just think, well, obviously it's going to be my husband, wife, or brother or sister, but maybe it shouldn't be, or maybe they're down as one person, but there's somebody else who is
exactly.
actually much more comfortable with this, and it won't stress them. Because, as you say, the last thing you want when you are going through the grieving processes is to think about someone you're leaving behind being very stressed by this, even though overall I think having a will is a good thing. So definitely worth thinking about.
We're recording this just before the 14th of February, just before Valentine's Day, but it probably won't go out until afterwards. But I think it is the best possible gift we could be thinking about to those that we love, is to be financially well organised. And that includes checking your will and checking your power of attorney and getting a file that lists everything that you've got so that they can look after things in your absence. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I forget the kind of heart-shaped steak or the overpriced bunch of flowers.
Yeah.
If you're in a relationship and you don't talk about money, show your partner your credit card statements or your bank statements. And as you say, get a will or a power of attorney, all those kind of things. I mean, I'm joking in a way, but it may not seem obviously romantic, but actually,
Yeah.
being open about money with your partner, thinking ahead. I mean, I think those are real, sort of acts of affection.
Definitely. And we talk so often, but there's the concept of having a money date. Spoke about it a bit in the She Finance work that I've done, but I'm sure that's not, I'm sure that's come up with you, and various different coaches talk about it as well as a financial coaching tool of, sitting down, having a money date, trying to make it a regular thing as well, not just a one-off, so that you're, keeping track of everything and opening those conversations more and more.
And I think it's really important, not just in the short-term finances, because there's lots of research that shows that women often have responsibility for the short-term finances, paying the bills and so on, in a couple. And not always, but men may take more responsibility for the longer-term finances. So things like the kind of mortgage, possibly, or certainly things like investing. And again, this is something I'm sure you talked about many times, but there's such a difference between how women approach something like investing and whether they do invest. So it's really important to talk about the day-to-day stuff, but it's so important to think about your long-term money goals, and where do you want to be financially in 5, 10, 15 years. And I don't mean like thinking, well, I want to have £500,000 or £100,000, or I want to have the mortgage paid off, but actually, what do you want the money for? I think sometimes, before I joined Royal London, when I was running my website, I would often talk about starting to save and thinking about pensions and retirement. But actually, it's really about what the money lets you do.
What's it
It's
for?
not about
Yeah.
it's not about the pension per se. It's the fact that you're building up a pot of money that when you stop working, whenever that's going to be, you can then do things that you want to do and not have to be terrified of putting the heating on, and actually have a life where you can see friends, take on hobbies, travel, whatever. And the same whether you're thinking about, okay, so you want to have your sort of cash savings to make sure that you can cover that unexpected bill. And again, without sort of shoehorning in our research, we've been basically tracking the effect of the cost of living since it started in 2022. So now do this research once a year. It was every 6 months. And one of the stats that first surprised me, we were looking at 4,000 adults and how they've been sort of affected. And this stat has stayed fairly consistent, and I find it quite shocking. I'll be sort of interested in your thoughts. Is that 1 in 5 adults has less than £100 in savings? Now, the first time the research showed me this, I kind of was like, really? And then 6 months later, we asked the same question. It came back, and it goes up. So it's sort of like 20%, 19, 18, and it's actually gone back up again. But it's very, very consistent. And now we can look at who is more likely to fall into that category in terms of age, gender, time of life, housing, if they're living in a place they've got a mortgage on, or if they're renting privately or from social housing, all those kind of things. But one of the things that's very interesting about it is we ask people how would they describe their financial situation. So everything from feel I'm in financial crisis, I can't pay my everyday bills, through to I'm comfortable, no worries. And I've been sort of analysing it through income and everything else. What seems to be the strongest indicator of whether someone will be at or near financial crisis is actually whether they have very little in savings. So some people on a low income, but with some savings, they're less likely to be in financial crisis than someone who is maybe on a slightly higher income, but who doesn't have savings. So it's those kind of things are sort of really, really powerful. So savings are really important, but also, when you then start looking at the longer term picture, and women, whether they have cash savings or invest, and look at something, for example, like a stocks and shares ISA, which is probably the product people are more familiar with in terms of having heard of it as an investment. And again, with some more research, and government figures back this up, I think it's 2/3 of those with stocks and shares ISA roughly are men and 1/3 are women. Now, this is not to say everyone should rush out and get stocks and shares ISA, but some of those people, women for this audience who've got cash savings, that they've started saving, which is fantastic, but it's just been sitting there. And, we know that men are more likely to think, well, actually, I don't need that, I'll go and invest it. And it's actually one of the reasons I started my website, Savvy Woman, years ago, because you talked to me and asked me about what I grew up with in terms of messages from my parents. And I think they tried their best to give me some really good messages, but they didn't invest. I didn't know anybody when I was growing up. None of my family, as far as I'm aware, invested. It wasn't something that I really grew up hearing about. And as I was going through life, although I was making some much better decisions, thanks for the area I was working in, I still didn't feel that investing, it didn't feel like it was something for me. I mean, I didn't consciously think that, but it just wasn't on my radar. And I know that's something that comes through quite strongly, and I'm sure you have those kind of conversations as well, that it just feels a little bit like, I think the way I used to describe it to myself was almost like, well, when I'm rich, then I can invest. I don't mean like fabulously rich, but I mean when I'm just a bit better off, that's the point at which I can invest, rather than thinking, actually, I could just put aside £50 a month or something, and that could help me to become, wealthier,
richer,
in inverted commas. Yes.
Yes.
It was like, oh, well, that's something that wealthy people do. That's something that older people do. That's something that people who are better off, that have a higher income, that have, there was probably all this little narrative in my head. And again, there's so much data that shows this, that I think women are more likely, for whatever reason, not necessarily the same reasons that I did, but to think investing isn't for them. And I think that's one thing that I certainly, didn't really grow up hearing about. And maybe I wouldn't have made different choices, maybe I would. But I think that's one lesson I have really taken away from, as a side effect of the work I've been doing.
And how do you think you balance, where we're running out of time, I've got two more questions. How do you think you balance now sort of that kind of future planning versus living for today? Because that's something I think in general, since pandemic and social media and stuff, is becoming almost like harder to battle through. This sort of living for today, must have experiences, but we still need to think about the future.
Yeah, I do definitely think about the financial future, my financial future, but I don't think I'm somebody who thinks about, well, I want to have this amount of money just for the sake of it. So I'm very much thinking about what I want my retirement to look like and what that will cost. And I've been quite sort of nerdy and spreadsheety about it.
Yeah, and cash flow planning, etc.
Yeah, but it isn't about sort of, living in a shoebox now and not doing anything, because, life has shown us, and I think the pandemic showed us really clearly, we do not know what's around the corner. And while, I definitely want to plan ahead, and I do want to think about life after work, whenever that is, I mean, there are things that are really important to me now. So for an example is for the last 2.5 years, I've been learning flamenco dancing. Now, nobody would pay good money to see me, but I love it. I really enjoy it. I find it quite hard to learn. I feel I'm using a different side of my brain to the part of my brain that I use when I'm working. But I also, there's something about it that I just find, I just love it. I think it's just an amazing form of dance. Now, I go to classes and I sometimes have private lessons, and that does come at a cost. But that's something that's really important to me. So therefore, I prioritize it. So I guess different people have different ways of doing this. But I'd say that something like that to me is, I mean, it's not a non-negotiable. It doesn't come above the rent or mortgage or anything, but there are other things I would sacrifice in order to carry on doing that. And not being able to do that, even though it might mean I have a bit more money in a few years' time, that to me doesn't feel like the right balance.
I love that. I need to see some of this flamenco dancing for sure.
Well, you maybe need to see someone doing flamenco dancing who's, like a natural at it. But as I said, I do find it, there's something about the actual dance itself and the sound it makes that I find kind of quite, I just think it's amazing. And I also feel it's just, I don't think about anything else when I'm learning. I mean, I think there's no
you
room
can't.
in my
You've got
brain
to
think
fully
about anything else
focus on that. And that, in a perspective of well-being, if you can remove your brain to something else entirely, I find is the best kind of almost therapy that you can have from what is a very busy life and all of the things that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, I'm lucky. There are other things I like doing as well. I love cooking, going out, all those sort of stuff. But I think I can do those and I can still sometimes think about my day-to-day life. Whereas I do think it's really important, whatever it is for you, to have something where there just isn't room for that. And it's not that necessarily your day-to-day life is stressful or anxiety inducing, although for some people, it may be, or it may be at certain times. But there is something that's quite powerful about just disconnecting from it. And although I have lots of other things I do that I enjoy, I don't think I disconnect in the same way as I do when I'm trying to learn the choreography.
Yeah.
Especially a new choreography in flamenco.
Absolutely. So just to finish off then, what's one piece of money wisdom you'd like everyone, or every woman particularly listening, to take away today?
Well, I'd almost say, like, if I say you can do it, that sounds a bit sort of cheesy. Just that wherever you are starting, unless you feel like you've actually got it all sorted from a financial point of view, there are things you can do. It's just like one step at a time. So I found it so powerful when I started making one slightly better money decision. And then it really motivated me to make others. And I think these days it's even easier than when I was kind of starting out in my career to find out information. Now, there is an issue sometimes that it's not accurate, but you've got access to a whole range of different resources, from very formal ones through to TikTok videos and so on. But I would just say, just start learning, just start whatever it is, set yourself some small goals and then kind of reward yourself. I don't mean necessarily, buying something, but think of something that you would like to motivate you to carry on. So I think the short answer would say you can do it, whatever it is, and then just start making those steps towards a better financial you.
Fantastic, Sarah. Thank you so much. I
Thank
guess,
you for
is there
asking me.
anywhere particular people can find you? What social media platform would you like us to sort of, people to find you on and find out more about the job things Royal London are doing, maybe?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on the main one I guess I use is LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram, which is a mix of greyhounds. I've got a greyhound, flamenco dancing, a little bit of personal finance.
Excellent.
And then also there's obviously there's quite a lot of stuff that I've got that's linked to what I'm doing in terms of my day job.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed our conversation, and thanks for sharing your thoughts.
I've enjoyed it too. Thank you for asking me.